Okay, and so we can just have a discussion. My name is Paula Maccabee, and I'm the Advocacy Director and Counsel for WaterLegacy. I've been doing this now for 14 years. And what we're talking about is really sulfate pollution and threats to wild rice. But a central part of this dynamic is the unnatural anthropogenic effects of industry, and in particular, the mining industry. So when I talk about it, I'm going to put sulfate pollution and the threats to wild rice in context of copper nickel mining. And yes, I wasn't going to talk about PolyMet in great detail because we had some really important news this week. I'm going to bring people up to date on what has happened with the Army Corps Wetlands Destruction Permit. And one of the things I'm going to talk about is WaterLegacy was formed by people in northern Minnesota who were concerned about the effects of industrial development, and in particular, proposed copper nickel mining on water resources throughout Minnesota, northern Minnesota, not just the boundary waters, but the St. Louis River and the Lake Superior watersheds, and what's coming up potentially now, which is also the watersheds of the Mississippi and St. Croix. And our goal is to protect water, health, and justice. What you're going to learn today is that the sulfate pollution, the mining pollution that's particular to copper nickel mining affects mercury contamination of fish, it affects human health, and it affects environmental justice. So all these things are wound up together. Now, what is sulfate pollution? I think it's important to realize that some areas, like northern Minnesota, are naturally low in sulfate. And so wild rice thrives there. And they're also sensitive benthic macroinvertebrates, namely little bugs and worms, that survive there and are the foundation for an aquatic food chain, which is also sensitive species of fish. And so the whole aquatic system is based on a system that's low in sulfate and low in many other chemicals. And today, taconite mines and coal plants are the largest dischargers of sulfate in Minnesota. And that is a legacy that when taconite mining was begun in Minnesota, that people were not aware that it would have that effect. And copper nickel mining, by its nature, would discharge massive quantities of sulfate. And that's because of the geology of the rock. And so mining is a source of sulfate pollution when rock containing sulfur is blasted out of the ground and exposed to air and water. And now I'm going to tell you that I'm not going to look at the chat, but other people are going to be looking at the chat. Our hosts are, and if you have questions as we go along, put them in the chat and we'll get to all of them at the end. And if something is a burning question, then let us know so that we can answer it as it comes along. And here's a picture of some of the really serious effects of sulfide mining and sulfate pollution. And I don't know if you know Len Anderson, but this is a picture on the far right of Len Anderson, and he's leaning on his canoe poles because back in 2010, he went back out and looked at areas in the St. Louis watershed where wild rice had been impaired by sulfate pollution. And those very shabby looking plants in the background are wild rice that has been impacted by sulfate pollution. And in the middle, you see sort of a dramatic example of acid mine drainage. And the coloration is indicative of the sulfur. And then on the far left, you see warning contaminated fish. Because one of the important effects of sulfate in an environment like Minnesota's, which is wetlands rich and water rich, is sulfate will increase mercury contamination of fish. Now, I mentioned before that the geology of hard rock mining is what the EPA calls it, or sulfide mining is what we generally call it, is that copper, nickel, and cobalt are bound up with sulfide in the ore itself. So it really is sulfide mining. And in a deposit like the PolyMet proposed mine deposit, with a low, which is a low grade deposit, there's actually a higher percentage of sulfide, of sulfur, than there is of the copper or the nickel that would have been mined. And the richer the ore, like an ore body like the proposed Talon mine has a higher concentration of nickel, that also means that there's going to be higher sulfate in the discharge just by nature of the geology. And sulfate exposed to air and water in high enough levels results in acid mine drainage and a dramatic increase in the leaching of toxic metals. But I think we also have to recognize that even at pH levels that are around neutral, many toxic metals will still leach. For example, nickel or arsenic or manganese will leach even if there is no acidic mine drainage as a result of sulfur mining. Now, sulfate in wetlands and sediments has two effects. One, it increases the release of inorganic mercury. Most of the mercury that we have in Minnesota is inorganic. It's the result primarily of fossil fuel combustion, both coal and oil. It is not necessarily the result only of combustion that takes place in Minnesota. A large percentage of the mercury in our watershed comes from airsheds as far away as China, or at least as far away as Texas. So that part of our mercury problem is a legacy of burning fossil fuels and air deposition. But inorganic mercury, if it just sits in the sediments or the wetlands, is not going to bioaccumulate and is not going to cause the kind of harm that we understand is toxic mercury contamination of fish. What happens is that in the presence of sulfate, there are bacteria that will change the composition of the mercury and make it an organic compound. They will methylate that mercury. And then that methyl mercury is the kind that bioaccumulates in the aquatic food chain. And it's toxic to wildlife like loons that are eating the mercury contamination of fish. It's toxic to bats that are eating mercury contaminated insects because they eat so many of them. And it's also toxic to the developing brains of fetuses, infants, and children, particularly fetuses, because the bones of women will release some of the mercury stored in their body during the pregnancy. An important fact is to realize that every sulfide mine in a water-rich environment like that in Minnesota has polluted either sulfate, either surface water and or groundwater with acid mine drainage and or toxic metals. So if you look at this from the perspective of protecting water quality, sulfide mining, copper nickel mining in a water-rich environment has a track record of 100% failure to protect water quality. And sort of this is a map to show how broad the potential effects of copper nickel mining are in northern Minnesota. And the map on your left shows the Duluth complex as sort of a pale orange. And you can see next to it in the more burgundy and red colors, that is the Iron Range. So even though they talk about the mining being in the Iron Range, what it really is moving closer to Lake Superior than the Iron Range. And the little circles that say CU, those are proposed copper nickel mines. Number one is the Polymet mine, because that was the furthest along. Number two is Twin Metals, which is now suspended because of the federal process about approving leases. Three is Encampment, and four is Tech. And Polymet's owner, Glencore, is now working very hard to put together a merger of Polymet and Tech, because actually Tech is a far bigger and richer deposit. And the mine, if Tech were to go forward, the mine itself would be located in the Rainy River watershed, and the pollution would flow north to the boundary waters. Now you can see off in the corner, I don't know if you can see, can you see my cursor here? I don't know if that actually shows up. Can you see that little arrow? There's one that is west of Duluth. It says number 5 and has a little CU circle. And that CU circle is the location of the proposed Talon Metals Rio Tinto mine, which is not part of the Duluth complex. It's actually part of a different geological body that has a higher percentage of copper and nickel. Now, if you look over at the right side of your screen, you can see this interesting red polygon. This is the 1854 Treaty Authority. So if you can visualize these two things mapped on each other, the 1855 the 1854, I'm sorry, ceded territory was ceded to the United States with the promise that that treaty reserved the rights of the Chippewa people, the Anishinaabe people, to hunt, fish, and gather. Needless to say, if pollution contaminates the fish, destroys the wild rice, and destroys the forests where one can hunt, those rights become meaningless. And so when we look at the potential for sulfate pollution, copper nickel mining, it's important to realize that the effects of sulfate, the effects on wild rice, are going to disproportionately impact the exercise of tribal treaty reserved rights to hunt, fish, and gather wild rice. And I don't know if you're aware of these small burgundy aspects, little polygons here. That is the remaining reservation land that the tribes were able to hold on to after the 1854 ceded territory. So they gave up rights to control land with the promise, which has maybe not been seriously enough considered, the promise that the ability to hunt, fish, and gather wild rice would not go away. Now, this is a map here. On the left-hand side, you can see those are the counties of Minnesota. And you can see that wild rice abundance is expressed with a darker red. So the darkest red of all is Aitkin County. That is the place where DNR has identified the most wild rice harvesting trips. I like to think of it as the breadbasket of wild rice, and people come from all over Minnesota to harvest wild rice in Aitkin County. And then St. Louis County, which is where the Polymet project would be proposed, is also in that category of being an area of wild rice abundance. Now, the Talon Rio Tinto mine is proposed right in the heart of Aitkin County, and you can see that that is in the midst of wild rice resources, and also that this is an area that affects tribal communities. So we're talking about the effects of sulfate, the vulnerability of wild rice, the preservation or loss of abundance. All of these issues will affect human health in terms of the nutrition from wild rice, will affect human health in terms of sulfate's effects on methylmercury, and will affect environmental justice, because the effects will be most disproportionately experienced by people who harvest wild rice, either for sustenance, and there are many low-income people who do that, native and non-native, and will disproportionately affect indigenous communities for whom wild rice is more than just a food. It's an important part of culture and spirituality. So I think probably everyone I'm talking to already knows that wild rice is particularly important. The Anishinaabe call it manuman. The Dakota people call it sin. And this is an annual plant that grows in lake and stream sediments. And the reason it is such an important bioindicator for clean water is that it needs to restore and grow new seeds every season. So if some pollution has entered in and affected those seeds, the next year's crop will be diminished, and then the seeds will be diminished, and then the year after that. And so it is a good indicator of whether an aquatic ecosystem is healthy. Wild rice is also an important food and habitat for waterfowl, wildlife, and fish. And for migratory ducks, it can sometimes be one of the most significant foods. It is also a high protein and sustainable food, which means that if people are relying on what they can grow, this is a very important part of their diet. And it's culturally and economically vital for both the Ojibwe and Dakota people, who have reserved rights to gather wild rice guaranteed by treaties. And it's actually part of the story of the Ojibwe people moving into this area from farther on the East Coast, that their prophecies talked about going until you find the food that grows on water. Because wild rice is not really a rice, it's a grass. And it is unique in the sense that it is growing on the water and is simply available. And despite the loss, severe loss due to development, and that includes agricultural development in central and south Minnesota as well, Minnesota still has more wild rice than any other state does. And then you have pictures here of the harvest and also of the wild rice. So this map is that you can see here this is DNR's map. And this was a map that DNR prepared in 2008 in collaboration with the tribes. And the little black dots identify the areas of wild rice density. And what you can see in the colors, when you get to yellow, you're getting to more than 10 parts per million of sulfate. When you get to the blue and the turquoise areas, those are low sulfate areas. And northeastern Minnesota is naturally quite low in sulfate, far below the 10 parts per million. And you can see isolated areas on the Iron Range, where as a result of taconite mining, you're seeing that yellow and red. And John Moyle, and this is back from the 1940s, he did the old-fashioned kind of research, which is he went out and sampled thousands of lakes. And he looked at where there is wild rice and where there wasn't, and he sampled for how much sulfate there was. And he found, as a matter of correlation, that there were, in order to have a large and abundant stand of wild rice, that only happened when the water had less than 10 parts per million of sulfate. And if you got above 50 parts per million of sulfate, the wild rice would be decimated, would be dying out. So when Minnesota, under the Clean Water Act, had an opportunity to adopt clean water standards, what they did is they approved a 10 part per million wild rice sulfate standard in 1973. And that was based on the science, and it was approved by the Environmental Protection Agency as consistent with the Clean Water Act. And the Fond du Lac Band and the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa also adopted the same 10 parts per million standard. But for decades, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency basically did not enforce the wild rice sulfate standard. They had enforced it once for Minnesota Power, and they gave Minnesota Power a variance, letting them pollute more than the 10 parts per million. And then they quietly just sort of removed that standard from that permit. And then in 2010, the Environmental Protection Agency, we're looking at environmental impact statement documents for taconite expansion and for the Polymic copper nickel mine. They basically said, listen, Minnesota, you have to enforce the sulfate rule. And in 2011, as part of the pushback against enforcement, the legislature funded a task force because they were hoping that if they did modern science, it would support a change that would weaken and relax the wild rice rule. Well, guess what the science found? What the science found is that sulfate actually does impact and decimate wild rice. But it wasn't the mechanism that was hypothesized. It wasn't that the sulfate in the water affected the growing plants. The primary mechanism was that the sulfate in the sediments reduced the capacity of the plant to thrive, took the nutrition out of the seeds, made them less fertile. And one of the big hypotheses that the industry was pushing is that you don't really need to limit sulfate if there is iron, because the sulfate's going to bind with the iron and everything is going to be fine. Well, these pictures on the left here are from Dr. John Pastor's research. And what he found and his PhD students found is that iron did bind with the sulfate, but the result was, and look at these roots on the right, these black roots. There would be plaques on the roots, and the roots would fail to provide sufficient nutrition for healthy seeds. So over time, the sulfate concentrations would decimate the wild rice. But what they also found, and this is a tub, they call it a mesocosm. They did the experiments in the tubs because you can't really affect and take the risk of damaging wild rice in a lake, they found that if you put sulfate in at a concentration of 300 parts per million, which is very consistent with what is being released today from taconite mines, it doubled the amount of mercury released from sediments to water and resulted in a 6 times or 6-fold increase of methyl mercury, the kind of methyl mercury, that's the mercury that bioaccumulates. And in fact, the science shows that methyl mercury can bioaccumulate. So at the top of the food chain, like a walleye or a northern, there would be 1 million times as much methyl mercury as just in the water column itself. And during this time in 2011, the Minnesota Health Department did a study with about 1,400 newborns born in the Lake Superior region of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And what they found in Minnesota is that 1 out of 10 infants born in the Lake Superior region were born with unsafe levels of mercury in the blood. And I asked some of the doctors who work with WaterLegacy, well, what does that mean, unsafe? And what they said is that the cutoff point that the Minnesota Health Department had used was the same cutoff point that the literature said would be enough to show a decline in intelligence quotient. So this is a serious risk to our next generation. And what they also found in these mesocosm studies, which had been hypothesized but hadn't been demonstrated as clearly before, is that when you add sulfate, you also release nitrogen and phosphorus from sediments. And that is a sufficient loading of excess nutrients to result in algae blooms in what had once been clear lakes. Now, I don't know if anyone is talking to me in the chat. Is there anything that I need to answer now before I keep going on to this beautiful sciencey slide? So please let me know, Megan or Jana. This beautiful sciencey slide was created by Amy Merbo, who's got a doctorate, and she's been working with WaterLegacy and also with the Boundary Waters. And you can see on the left the natural condition where the phosphorus, which is P, the nitrogen N, the mercury, which is Hg, they stay in the ground. They stay in the sediment at the bottom of a lake or the bottom of a wetland. And when you get sulfate pollution, it creates toxic sulfide, which interacts with the bacteria in the sediments. And it releases P, which is the phosphorus, it releases N, which is nitrogen, it releases mercury. All of these, it releases just about doubles the amount in the water. And the phosphorus and the nitrogen will result in algae. And the mercury, not only will there be twice as much mercury in the water, but the sulfate will result in a methylation process. So the fish will end up getting a double whammy of more mercury in the water and more methylation, and will be much more contaminated and much more dangerous for wildlife and humans to eat. And once again, for the tribal communities in Minnesota, eating fish is part of their culture as well as part of their subsistence. So one of the big struggles then throughout, it's now a decade of work, is as soon as EPA told the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency to enforce the sulfate standard, the Chamber of Commerce and the mining industry pushed back really hard. And mining polluters, coordinated by the Chamber of Commerce, first they sued to block enforcement. They sued the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. WaterLegacy intervened because we were not confident that the state was going to be gung-ho about supporting the standard. And we won in both the district court and the appeals court. So the next effort then was that study I mentioned in 2011, and WaterLegacy and Fond du Lac Band, we served on the thing, and it was an enormous time suck. And at the end of the process, there wasn't really any voting. MPCA just put forward the idea of creating this very complicated rule that would really weaken the ability ever to limit sulfate. And WaterLegacy and the Fond du Lac Band and the 1854 Treaty Authority and the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, and other groups, we all opposed that proposal by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency to basically repeal the rule that limited wild rice to 10 parts per million and open something wide open so that each lake would have to be argued on a case-by-case basis. And mining companies could say, well, we are letting iron go in the water so we could pollute more with sulfate. Well, in a very unusual case and a huge victory in 2018, the administrative law judge who had been hearing all this public testimony, and probably people who are on this Zoom have been among the people who testified, the administrative law judge disapproved the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's repeal plan and upheld the sulfate standard. And no sooner had the administrative law judge, and by the way, the chief judge also affirmed that, no sooner had the administrative process affirmed the validity of the science than the industry went to the legislature. And twice the legislature passed a bill that would say, we're just going to repeal the standard completely. Heck with that. We don't need to follow any guidance or law or any science. We just could go in and do that. And Mark Dayton, as a result of a huge amount of organizing, both in the indigenous and non-indigenous, and we worked in partnership with a lot of other environmental groups as well as with the tribes, Mark Dayton vetoed the bill twice. So the bills to repeal the wild rice sulfate standard also fell by the wayside. And then in 2021, WaterLegacy and the Fond du Lac Band appealed from a taconite mine permit, the Mintac tailings basin, which is a U.S. Steel project. And the court then ruled that the sulfate standard must be enforced under the Clean Water Act. So if there is federal jurisdiction, then you can't have a state law that says you have a standard, but we're not enforcing it. And finally, after, I don't know, 11 years or 12 years of work on this, the EPA agreed with WaterLegacy and the tribes that Minnesota's Clean Water Act program must apply the sulfate standard despite Minnesota session laws. So we got to the point where we're actually, I can say confidently that this law that limits sulfate pollution to 10 parts per million is a valid law, and at least wherever the Clean Water Act applies, that law must be applied. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And here, once again, is a picture of Len Anderson, is that unless a water body is recognized as impaired, it's very hard to limit pollution, and it's very hard to get all of the different polluters to have a budget so that they have to reduce their pollution and clean up the water. And from 2012 to 2022, we worked with tribes to demand that the state Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, identify the wild rice waters that had already been harmed by pollution so that we could clean them up and we could be absolutely sure that we're not allowing more pollution in with new permits. And finally, in 2021, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency overruled our state's unwillingness to list wild rice impaired waters and listed 33 waters impaired due to sulfate. And in 2022, MPCA then sort of went along with what the EPA said, and they listed 35 waters that are impaired due to sulfate. And we and the tribes did a lot of work to try and get the data put together for the EPA and for the MPCA, and we were successful with 35 waters, but that is not all the waters that are actually impaired. And I'm going to talk specifically about Birch Lake as an example of the work that is being done by citizen scientists within Northern Lake Science Advisory Panel and Northeastern Minnesotans for Wilderness primarily to get that data together. But I think it's really important that we are now moving forward now. MPCA is no longer denying that waters are wild rice waters. They're no longer denying that if the sulfate level is too high, that water that has wild rice growing or has historically had wild rice, if there's 10 parts per million or or more exceedance of that standard in that wild rice water, it is impaired and it needs to be dealt with appropriately under the Clean Water Act. But that is progress on the area of wild rice. I still want to highlight that Minnesota has no sulfate standard that is specifically to protect mercury release or mercury methylation. MPCA proposed way back in 2006 that they would develop that strategy. It was a very detailed memo, but there has been no action since. So even to this day, any protection of wild rice from sulfate, that really is our only tool to protect our health as an indigenous or a non-indigenous community, and tribal resources and ecosystems from the much broader effects of sulfate on everything from wild rice to mercury to excessive nutrients. And so because of the gaps in our regulatory structure, focusing on wild rice impaired waters is very important. Now, here's an example of a map. And this is prepared by the Northern Lakes Scientific Advisory Panel. This is Birch Lake. You can see I'm not sure if you can read it on your computer. I suppose it depends how big your screen is. This is Birch Lake, which is the entryway into the Rainy River watershed. And the sources of pollution, this is Adunca Bay. This is a source of pollution from the current North Shore Peter Mitchell mine. This is Bob Bay, which is a source of pollution from the Dunca mine, primarily a closed mine. And what you can see, these numbers, 19.9 or 50.2, those are the concentration in parts per million of sulfate. And the closer one is to the sources of historical and ongoing taconite mine pollution, the greater that exceedance of the water quality standards. And these groups, citizen groups, have been doing the science to sample because after the 1980s copper nickel mine study, there was really a gap in inadequate sulfate sampling of Birch Lake, which is very important to people who are concerned about wild rice, and also people who are concerned about protecting the boundary waters from mercury contamination. And we've spent the past 1.5 years working with the Pollution Control Agency, with the Northern Lakes Scientific Advisory Panel, and Northeastern Minnesotans for Wilderness. And finally, we've been able to get citizen data updated into the MPCA system so that they will have no excuse in failing to identify Birch Lake as a wild rice impaired water. And I've just put the quotes from the Clean Water Act on the side. The Clean Water Act actually says that states have to consider all the data, and waters where academic groups or members of the public have identified issues with water quality are supposed to be their priorities. And we're finally getting that to happen for wild rice. And the next step planned, I've talked to NILSAP, their next step plan is to look at the areas where there's pollution flowing from taconite mines, sulfate pollution, going upstream into the boundary waters to see what effects it has, not just on wild rice, but also on increased mercury contamination of fish. And is there really a correlation that the closer you get to the source of the sulfate pollution, the higher concentrations of mercury you're likely to find? And that sampling is going to start, I think, early fall. So if you're interested at all in doing sulfate sampling, I'm going to ask you just take a notepad or put it in, maybe Megan or Jana can put it in the chat. If you were to send an email to Sophia, SOPHIA at WaterLegacy.org. Sophia and I are working to help NILSAP and identify people who might be interested in doing sulfate sampling and or mercury sampling to protect the Lake Superior watershed and also the Boundary Waters Rainy River watershed. Once again, it's Sophia, SOPHIA, at waterlegacy.org. And we've been working now with NILSAP for the past, about almost a year now, to sort of support their work, because they're an organization formed with scientists who coach people in how to do sampling and then coordinate making sure that everything gets done correctly by the labs. And then I want to just bring everybody up quickly to date on PolyMet, because this week was an explosive week. I know many people are aware that there have been irregular procedures throughout the permitting process, and that the Trump administration EPA suppressed their own comments at the request of the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, saying that the pollution from PolyMet would violate the Clean Water Act, and that the permit was also reversed on the basis of the permit to mine was also reversed. So if we're looking today, looking at the beginning of this week, there had been no digging at the PolyMet mine. This cartoon asks, are they already digging the mine? Nope, they're burying the EPA comments that oppose it. And we had a very unusual situation in Minnesota, because our agencies did not follow their own rules. They didn't follow their own rules about preserving official records. And they, for the first time ever, asked a federal agency not to comment, the oversight agency, so there would be no record of the agency's concern, the federal agency's concerns. So that kind of unusual, irregular procedure slowed the process down. Usually, permits are not suspended while court challenges take place, but they were at PolyMet, because the courts were so concerned about the unusual nature of the process. So there hasn't been any digging to date. The permit to mine has been reversed, both because it had no time limits, and also the reclamation plan had some really serious concerns. The water pollution permit had been reversed, but reversing a permit does not prevent reissuance. So let's take us to this week. This week, breaking news: the U.S. Army Corps revoked the PolyMet wetlands destruction permit. And that lovely picture actually is a picture of the wetlands on the PolyMet site. WaterLegacy canoed up there in 2017, and I was there on that wetland when they took that picture. And even though the Clean Water Act specifically says that a downstream state or a tribe can object to a federal permit that would result in violation of its water quality standards, this has not been exercised. It hasn't been exercised by the 50 states, possibly because once they raised an objection, the upstream developer negotiated with them and solved the problem. And Fond du Lac Band is the first tribe ever to engage in this process under the Clean Water Act. And this process is complicated. First, the EPA has an ironclad obligation to give them notice and start the process and to say, do you want to object? And Fond du Lac had to go to court in order to get EPA to do that under the prior administration. And then Fond du Lac made its own determination based on the science that the PolyMet permit will affect the reservation mercury standards and also specific conductivity standards. And this is not a slam dunk, though, because then the EPA has discretion. And the EPA looked over all the science on mercury and also on ionic pollution, and they agreed with Fond du Lac, and they agreed with the science that we'd been working to develop for 8 years in alliance with the tribe. They agreed that the federal permit for PolyMet will violate Fond du Lac standards. And sort of fittingly, the U.S. Army Corps this week on D-Day, June 6th, revoked PolyMet's wetlands destruction permit based on the band and the EPA science. This is a major victory for clean water, because what the Army Corps explained is there was nothing in the record showing that there were conditions on the PolyMet permit that would protect Fond du Lac's water quality, and that PolyMet has the ability to go and create a new permit, but implicit in the way that decision was written, unless that permit addresses and resolves and creates conditions to protect the band's water quality standards, it is not likely to satisfy the requirements of the Clean Water Act. Now, we don't know what PolyMed is going to do or what Glencore is going to do, but this is a really significant setback. And I've been asked a lot, well, did you expect it? Well, yes and no. Yes, I expected it because the science is very clear. And that is science that Brian Branford has developed, as well as the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. And the EPA knows Dr. Branford's work. We've sent it to them. We've shared it with them for years. He's been one of WaterLegacy's primary experts. And also the information on the specific conductivity, the pollutants that harm the fish and the little bugs and worms. It was actually two scientists who were retired from the this Minnesota state regulatory agencies, the DNR and the Pollution Control Agency, that did this initial study about the vulnerability of northern Minnesota to not only sulfate, but ionic pollution. And the EPA had reviewed their study and had approved it and had done their own work. So this is actually, the science had been over a decade in the making. So according to the science, the Army Corps had only one way to go. And also the law says, and that's by statute and by regulation, that the Army Corps is not an expert on water quality. The EPA is an expert. And on its own reservation, if a tribe has gone through all the different procedures to be treated as a state and to adopt water quality standards, that tribe is considered an expert. So the law and the science were both clear. I guess the element of surprise is that Glencore didn't in some way corrupt the process, and that law and science worked. So maybe as we get, as we move forward, that might set a precedent not only for this PolyMed case, but that law and science would triumph, and that would be the best outcome of all. And so here we are. These pictures here, you can see an example of tabling. We're just talking to people, an example of a whole lot of environmental groups coming together to lobby at the Capitol. And here's some pictures of folks who went out to do water quality sampling with the Northern Lakes Scientific Advisory Panel. And there are so many things you can do to help reduce sulfate pollution, protecting both wild rice, human health, and environmental justice. You can volunteer, WaterLegacy.org, or you can send your if you want, like to volunteer once again, whether it's for citizen science or for self-advocacy or for tabling and communicating with others, please feel free to email Sophia@WaterLegacy.org or just info@WaterLegacy.org, and we'll get to you. And I want to say that we've had successes and we're likely to have continued successes only if everybody in the community is involved. And we're going to be facing additional threats from the Talon mine and at the Talon Rio Tinto mine in the Aitkin County area. You can see in the news that none of the companies that are trying to do copper nickel sulfide mining in the Boundary Waters area or the Lake Superior watershed have agreed to back off, and they're going to continue working. So we need to continue to work also. Just want to thank you for your support for clean water. You can see a picture from Fond du Lac Band of wild rice. That's us in the middle canoeing up the Partridge River. And that's the St. Louis River on the far right, in celebration of the great wind this week. So I would love to hear from people and either answer questions or just talk. So what do people want to know?
Hi, everyone. I lost service for a second at the beginning. I'm Megan from the Wild Rice Project in Finland. Thank you, Paula. That was really great. I've got a couple comments and questions.
I can I can just start at the top.
Yeah, go for it.
And see what we've got here. I've got a question here. Why, and I'm going to make sure this is, but please, you know, if at this point, I can't see you, anyone, so unfortunately, we have to use the chat one. But the first question that I see is, why would the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency suppress comments, not want the EPA comments? And the answer is we were not able to completely identify their motives, but they were very well aware by that time. The EPA had said they were very critical of the proposed polymet permit, and they felt it would violate the Clean Water Act. And we had at least the assistant commissioner admitting that if these comments were revealed, it would cause bad press. It would create pressure maybe to do something better or different for that mine. And so part of it, we know that they didn't want it in the record where it could help us with appeals. They didn't want it in the press, but exactly how that happened, we will never know. What we do know is that it was unprecedented and that it was wrong. It was contrary to the way not only Minnesota rules, but the Clean Water Act says how you operate. Let's see, what else do we have here? Somebody else mentioned that methyl mercury has other effects. It does. I think they were talking about ED. In children, it results not only in loss of intelligence quotient, but also all kinds of behavioral and learning disabilities. And the reason we focus on the neurological impacts is that it doesn't take as high, it takes a relatively small amount of mercury to see those effects. And also the developing fetus is about 4 to 5 times more sensitive than an adult. So this is, even what we might think of as relatively modest levels of increase in mercury contamination of fish can have really serious consequence for families. And one of the points that a couple of our child psychiatrists in Duluth kept making is that once there's been mercury contamination and its neurological impacts, it can be managed, but you can never, there's no cure. Okay. And the trifecta currently in St. Paul, now's the time to get state sulfate standards. So here what we have is we have a state sulfate standard, 10 parts per million, to protect wild rice. But our agency, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and the DNR, have been very adamant about not wanting to talk about how sulfate also affects mercury contamination. So we have a standard, and thank God we were able to save it, a standard that will protect wild rice. But there are many parts of Minnesota where there is no wild rice growing and fish are still getting contaminated. And there are many parts of Minnesota where people are eating that fish and they are vulnerable, or where bats are eating mercury contaminated insects and are dying. So I think it's not true. Minnesota doesn't have a standard for sulfate that protects against the threat of mercury methylation and contamination. And that is a really big deal. And then there's another question, I think it's Sydney Trimble. Is there nothing developed for decontamination? Well, that's a broad question. One of the things that Nancy Schultz was saying is they've done some research. If there's an area where wild rice is very fragile, is very thin, and due to high sulfate, and the sulfate pollution is reduced, that because there's a bank of seeds in the sediment, that what the Fond du Lac Band has seen is that if you stop the pollution, the wild rice can rejuvenate. And that's a very positive aspect. If you're talking about decontamination in humans, once there's mercury vulnerability and harm to the neurological system, that kind of decontamination is not available. What am I missing here? And mercury pollution, is it a function of smokestack industries? That is a really a good point. Mercury pollution is a function of smokestack industries, and in particularly the coal industry and the taconite industry. Some of the like the energy industries, like around the Twin Cities, for example, they were repowered. The coal plants were converted to gas plants. In other areas, there have been wet scrubbers put on coal plants. Taconite pollution, mercury pollution, is one of the few areas that Minnesota has had no progress in cutting back mercury emissions, despite having done the study, the total maximum daily load study, and concluded that each part of the sector had to reduce their mercury emissions. Lots of other sectors have reduced, and the taconite has been exempt until recently. And the EPA is now finally working on technology-based standards, because obviously Minnesota was not doing this on their own. And this is a question: there is a chance for nature rebounding. I think that's I know about the question of sulfate and wild rice, and the answer is yes. The answer is that nature can rebound this, and but some of the harm would remain. And I think that part of the benefit of the whole Clean Water Act impaired waters listing is it is a tool to cut back pollution and give nature a chance to rebound. Now, I think there was another question here: is there a water quality standard east of the Mississippi River? And I think there's really important, the sulfate standard, the 10 parts per million, would apply throughout the Mississippi River watershed, which is really some of the richest, most abundant wild rice in Minnesota, perhaps anywhere. But there is a more stringent mercury standard that applies to Lake Superior, because it was set through an international treaty. The standard that is set for the Mississippi River or the St. Croix River is not as protective as the standard that applies for the Polymint mine. So that is a really important issue, is to realize that the mercury standard that was violated for the Polymint project, including the very stringent downstream Fond du Lac band standard, is more stringent than what would be applicable for a Talon Metals Rio Tinto mine. Okay, one new message. I don't know if is the DNR working to support the science? I think the DNR has a very big problem. The DNR is charged with promoting mining, and a huge share of their revenue comes from mining royalties. And they have spent a lot of money actually helping companies identify, based on magnetic readings, where the ore is. So DNR has the powerful money producing, revenue producing part of DNR is pro mining. There are also people in DNR who are responsible for protecting our water, protecting our fish, protecting our wild rice. But I think those people play a very, very minor part in any of the decisions that have to do with developing the mining industry, and that the science on many of these issues is unduly influenced by the part of the DNR's split mission that is to support mining rather than sustainable nature for all of us forever. So I'm sure DNR is working to support science, but it may be from a perspective that is less than neutral. Is there a difference between sulfate pollution and heavy metals? Yes, there's every pollutant that results from copper nickel mining or another industry has different effects. I mean, for example, arsenic is often released in the mining process, and arsenic is a carcinogen. And if you look at lead that is also released in mining process, that is a neurotoxic. And sulfate reactions will increase the release of many of these chemicals, but they're not necessarily, the chemicals will still be released, these heavy metals, even if it is not enough sulfate to be acid mine drainage. But each pollutant is different. And for example, the LTV area, the LTV mine, that closed tailings basin is still has enough manganese to result in elevated concentrations in drinking wells. And manganese has neurotoxic effects on children and infants, who, particularly if they're bottle fed, but also has been correlated with effects on the elderly in terms of neurological problems. So we've talked mostly today about surface water, but some of the chemicals that are released from industrial processes, including hard rock mining, are also impacting human beings through groundwater and drinking water wells. Let's see, did I get everything? Are there other questions? Please.
I think we've got it.
Now, you want to unmute everybody, so if they want to chat for a couple of minutes, we have just a, if that's possible. I don't know if I can't see you, but maybe you could, maybe you could talk anyhow.
Yeah, let me see. Ask all to unmute. So I think anyone who wants to speak can go ahead and hit unmute.
And since I don't have you on my screen, if you're going to say something, please say your name first. Is there anyone who wants to say anything at all? This is your chance. This is your platform.
Well, I'm going to jump in and just say a couple things that I missed in the beginning. This has been such a great presentation, and I'm so excited about it. We had really great turnout. Also, though, Lisa just told me there's no unmute button, so let me try that again. Allow panelists to unmute themselves.
Yeah, you want to allow everybody to unmute themselves too.
Ask all to unmute. One question while I'm working on that is, what is involved in being a citizen scientist?
Well, I'm going to say that both, that what Northern, I call it NILSAP because Northern Lakes Scientific Advisory Panel, they are actually organized by a couple chemists. And so what they do is they come, if you want to do sampling, they will teach you how. They will explain to you where to go, how to use your GPS to identify where you were, where your canoe is located, how to put in this, how to capture the sample in your little jar, how deep to go to put it, and how to keep it, sort of keep the chain of custody so it'll be a valid sample. And then all the part that has to do with like getting it to the lab and making sure the lab does it right, we've already worked out the kinks on that. So what it will be involved is working, NILSAP will go out with you. They will, sort of train you and then work on the process so that all the data actually gets used in the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency process. So it's, that's why I gave you Sophia's contact information. She will hook you up with NILSAP when they go out and do testing. And they've been really successful in getting good results that can be used by the government. So don't feel, everybody, citizen scientists. Eric Morrison is a chemist, and the people he works with are all, there are a couple citizens who are really experienced, and their job, they feel that their pleasure as well as their task is to teach other people, so it becomes like a manageable task. So those young people that you saw in that picture, they were sampling. I mean, they went out with a crew, but they were actually doing the citizen science because they were doing it under the supervision of an expert. So that was a great question. I think Chris has got his hand up. I don't know if you can unmute yourself, Chris, or if you have to stick it.
Oh, yeah, I think I got it. Can you hear me?
Yeah, here.
Perfect. Well, my concern, I'm a retired mining engineer and I've been involved in sulfate mining in South Carolina and permitting. And what is apparent to me is this egregious shenanigans that's going on in Minnesota that is totally untransparent. I mean, what happened in South Carolina can't play out in Minnesota because this lack of political transparency. It's just there's just such a outrageous bunch of lies about what the technology is that's going to be used, the technical expertise that's behind it, and the enforcement. I guess my big question is that the permitting process works by the nose of the camel in the tent. And the first permit is going to be amended to expand the project to, whatever size it's going to be. But what it bothers me is that no one has talked about the second largest copper deposit on the planet being mined. And where is the smelter going to be put? Is it going to be Duluth or someplace? It's like this never-ending dribble of, oh, well, we need this, or this is going to have to be a little bit bigger here. And then the environmental impact assessment isn't inclusive of all these other things. So I guess that's what bothers me, is that I'm really appreciative of what you're doing, Paula, because there isn't any other spear tip that's wiggling its way in to stop this. And well, I just wanted to thank you that I know what you're doing and what's going on, and it just seems remarkable, the level of international focus of these big mining giants to come to Minnesota and just do mineral piracy. And I guess I'd like to help. What can we do? So include me.
Well, I think there are a couple different points, Chris. I think one of the things that everybody has to realize is that no matter what you get in the first permit, it is going to expand, and it's going to expand based on profits and opportunities. And even if the first permit is issued with the thought that maybe it would help with the EV economy, if there is a higher bidder for those metals, it's going to go there. And then the other piece is, I know that Talon Metals got 114 million promised by the federal government to do some kind of processing in North Dakota. I don't know if that's going to be a smelter, but I think we need to understand that the processing that's been happening in Minnesota to date we've never had a smelter. What we've had are we've had processors that do flocculation and reduce the volume of ore into concentrate, and then that concentrate has gone elsewhere. But what we have in Talon is they're proposing that they won't even do the processing here at all. And the economics of transporting that raw ore by rail, it's unprecedented to do that for 400 plus miles, and it may or may not actually come to fruition. So I think we need to look at this with the broadest possible lens, and prove it first legislation would be usually helpful. But I think it's very, very important to realize not only has the legislature not taken a vote on any legislation that would curb mining, they have not even allowed a hearing. So this is a very huge problem, is that there is no democratic process operating in the face of mine power. So there's we talked a little bit about how the regulatory process is broken, how the MPCA did things that are unprecedented, how the DNR is torn in its mission and is not very effective. The legislature has, WaterLegacy is one of the co-sponsors of the Prove It First. Friends of the Boundary Waters is the lead organization there. We've supported them for years, and they have not even been able to get a hearing where some scientists could come in and explain what this is about, let alone getting an actual bill passed. And so many of the things that we know would help protect Minnesota never even crossed the door. Back in the 1980s, when they studied the whole issue of copper nickel mining, and they looked at the comprehensive effects, not in one little EIS, not with one company pushing the results, but cross-disciplinary, independent scientists, they decided this was not a good idea. They didn't want to move forward. And right now, when we're looking at so many mining proposals, and mining proposals, not just on the Duluth complex, but mining proposals in the headwaters of the Mississippi and the St. Croix, no one is looking at the cumulative impacts of all of these mines, of all of these waste storage facilities, and of the potential processing, which is, it's not a given that it's all going to go someplace else. And even if it were just the initial concentrate process, there'd be a mountain of reactive tailings to deal with. So, I mean, I don't have any insight on how to change Minnesota politics, but if you have any time or energy, I'm not saying what party, because I encountered a great deal of courage on either side of the aisle, but we need to start having a politics that responds to this very significant ecological and existential threat to our waters, and at least considers all the different risks together and decides, do we really want to go there?